Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I'm Joshua Martin, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. In The Lead this week, we take a deep dive into the deep state. The term itself is more recent, but it's an old idea. The fear that the government you see is not the real government, but merely the puppet of the shadowy network which is really pulling the strings. In America, such ideas have been percolating since the 1950s, especially among hard-right groups like the John Birch Society. But it was only during the Trump administration that the concept really went mainstream. Trump routinely blamed his failures on the deep state, and continues to accuse opponents of being part of it. The conspiracy theory proved very compelling to many of his supporters. In its most extreme form, the QAnon conspiracy cult used the term to refer to an international cabal of child-murdering Satan worshippers, a cabal which they claimed included prominent politicians and celebrities. QAnon believers have been implicated in multiple domestic terror incidents and were prominent participants in the January 6th Capitol attacks. But the term deep state is not an American one. It originates in Turkey, where it refers to something very real. For decades, a parallel power structure within the Turkish state has operated without the consent of the official government. I'm joined today by Josef Burton, a former American diplomat who was posted at the US Embassy in Ankara during the Trump presidency. He wrote an essay for New Lines comparing the American conspiracy of the deep state to the Turkish reality, which has proved increasingly relevant over subsequent months, especially following the FBI raid of Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. Josef, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So I wanted to start by, I've talked about the deep state in the introduction there, but just if you could talk a little bit more about the deep state in Turkey and how it's operated historically.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And it's sort of like an interesting topic because it has very, very hard confirmed factual elements, but it's also got fuzzy edges. When you're talking about the Turkish Republic in its kind of modern incarnation, it kind of, evolves out of modernizing movements at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And it's one of the only countries I know of where they basically say that their current state intelligence service, the Turkish CIA, MIT, originated as a secret brotherhood among Ottoman army officers, right? So there were these sorts of Turkish nationalist groups in the late 19th century who were operating and forming cliques and cabals to sort of deal with what they felt to be the inevitable collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But when you talk about the Turkish deep state, for a lot of people, the point was the 1990s. This was sort of like a car crash. Turkey was a country that had had military coups. It had had a very intense Cold War era struggle between the state and leftist groups. But it was really the moment of this car crash. This BMW gets hit by a truck in the Aegean region, and driving it are like a Kurdish clan leader, a police general, and a far right mafia drug baron, and some unnamed young women who flee the scene immediately. And then the trunk is just full of like Deutschmarks and silent submachine guns. And that was sort of the breaking force to the surface of like, wow, something is going on that we don't know about. These guys should not be hanging out together. What's up? What is it? And that kind of brings into popular consciousness here and kind of coins the term deep state, which is something that kind of gets dragged up in the 1990s and early 2000s. When you're talking about the early days of the Justice and Development Party of Erdogan's administration, he kind of pitched himself to liberals in Turkey and also in Europe and the United States as sort of like, well, I'm the guy you understand, I have a democratic mandate. This deep state, this thing, this undemocratic, out of control state within a state is something that I'm going to bring to heel with democracy. Now, I think we all see how that developed and where that went. But at the time, it was something that people were talking about. I first came to Turkey as an exchange student in 2005. And that's the first time I heard the phrase deep state was in one of these dormitory cafeteria conversations.
And so when that was revealed, was that a surprise on the whole to the Turkish public? Or was this always kind of an open secret? Like they always knew that something was going on, but never could confirm it?
Well, para-state forces were there. Everyone knew the Bozkurtlar, the Grey Wolves, which are the kind of big fascist street fighting organization, and kind of the foot soldiers of the Turkish far right were there,
and still are,
and still very much still are. And that that was always there, but the idea in the 1990s that this wasn't just state repression a la Chile or Argentina. This wasn't just, the cops or maybe the secret cops arresting someone, but that things might be happening that the government itself does not control, really emerges in the 1990s. And I think that's kind of inextricable from what Turkey was kind of going through as it emerged from the 1980s, which were really the peak of state repression. There was a lot of mistrust, but also, sort of openings to begin to question and talk about things, and also a divergence of the elected Turkish government from the consensus of the security services, right? Which is all sort of around the Kurdish question and what was happening in southeastern Turkey at that time.
Right, and that's when the deep state begins to come to light, right? And I think it's important just to stop a moment and emphasize that this is stuff that's documented, it's proven. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how we know these things.
Right. I mean, so what kind of happens is there is, I think, and it really is in the 1990s, this kind of global moment of some people really kind of going, well, I guess the Cold War's over. We can kind of hash this stuff out. And that happens, in Turkey in the 1990s, where there's this interesting coinciding of like a level of parliamentary democratization, post-military rule, with the country's most brutal internal conflict. And then also in Western Europe, a kind of moment of, consensus liberal government, where there's an idea of like, okay, well, now it's time for all those things that we said were just a measure to contain communism out of expediency to happen. So, you do have, investigations in Italy. Like the reason everyone calls Operation Gladio is because there were investigations in Italy which revealed that there were these NATO, not Italian national intelligence, but NATO efforts to create a stay-behind network. You look at investigations in Turkey in the 1990s and especially like early 2000s, which revealed the existence of a lot of these organizations. And there was a big scandal around the existence of an organization called JITEM, which was the paramilitary police, the gendarmerie's intelligence section, which officially did not exist. Even people within the Turkish paramilitary police did not know that JITEM existed. Right. So it was basically autonomous units within the country's own security services operating without the knowledge of the security services. Right. So this does happen. States are secret and fractious. And there's a number of times I could mention that there's been reporting stories where, the State Department and the CIA have backed different sides of the same civil war. Right.
Yes.
And that happens, but theoretically that all goes through the chain of command and someone knows that they are doing it. It's just that in states that get big enough, it's hard to resolve these contradictions. And I think that, the idea of deep state is that there's not like a contradiction or a mistake or kind of a structural conflict, but that like elements within the state are just doing what they want and without any kind of going back to the chain of command. They're just doing it.
Right. They're intentionally hiding their activities from their superiors, or even consider themselves to have superiors that aren't the official superiors.
That aren't the official superiors. And I think that's exactly it. It's a question not just about state criminality, but like autonomous state criminality. There's states breaking the law, which they do all the time, right? That's being the state is giving yourself the permission to break the law. But there's also parts of states breaking away from their own authority and control, which I think is part of this kind of, these things that really make a deep state, which is lack of accountability to any kind of leadership and criminality as opposed to states of exception. And then an idea of operating kind of deniably. And this can be kind of splitting hairs, but I think it's important to, when we start talking about like the post 9/11 era and especially QAnon and the sort of moment we're in, where there are conspiratorial accusations, false flags, when you talk about them in the United States now, you think about like Alex Jones, for example, the conspiratorial TV web host, basically saying to the parents of dead children from the Sandy Hook mass shooting that was a false flag. Your kids aren't dead. They never existed. They were actors. But like the idea of false flag is something that has historically happened. And I think it's important that the more unhinged and irrational these sorts of terms become, the way they kind of break free and start floating around discursively, I think the more we have to point to concrete historic examples of this defined thing.
Yes.
And I don't just mean something that has a lot of loose ends or a lot of things that feel weird about it, because I myself love, a complicated historical event, right?
Yeah, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes when it gets fishy. This isn't fishy. This is real.
It was not fishy, it's real.
Yeah.
And so I think that things like the fact that in Italy, far right mafia linked groups that were NATO supported did conduct false flag attacks to pursue a strategy of tension to make sure the Communist Party did not win an election in Italy in the 70s. That's real. Journalists, the Italian parliament, they've looked into it. And I think that the more lurid political discourse becomes, I think the more we have to focus on the specificity of those incidents and the kind of objective reality of them, to talk about what they are and not immediately let the breach in normalcy kind of spin out.
Right, yes. That's the sort of the difference between conspiracy theory and conspiracy, is that when they really are out to get you, it leaves a trail.
Right. And I think we are in this moment, though, where it's interesting, where there is this kind of like, things are kind of breaking loose. They're becoming unmoored. And there's this sort of terror that everyone's living inside their own universe and their own reality and their own kind of construction. And there's not a lot of analytical frameworks out there that are shared or even systematic, right? I mean, I think, we were talking a bit before the recording about how you got me into following QAnon in Scotland, and just like QAnon in the United States, there's just completely free form, completely what's the term, like syncretic kind of political thoughts, where you can put together anything. And I'm seeing these quotes of like, we need someone to stop the corporations because the corporations are going to implement communism and they're going to make America communist. And I'm just like, this is an amazing set of assumptions and vocabulary that can lead someone to a statement like this, right? But there's this idea that, if only you knew the correct facts, then things would kind of calm down and our social fabric would be healed, right, by some sort of authoritative discursive analysis. And so, you use certain keywords or something and something pops up on Twitter, right? You were talking about, being vaccinated or something like that. You get a little COVID-19 reminder and it pops up and it says, you can look at the information. I don't think anyone who thinks that this is George Soros trying to turn me gay with nano machines is going to click on that and be like, oh, wow, thank you.
Of course not. Because, I mean, a lot of the people who are promoting these lies know that they're lies. I mean, you talked about Alex Jones earlier. Alex Jones doesn't believe most of what he says, but he knows that it's useful to him.
Yeah.
The same is true of Donald Trump. I mean, we've been talking about the deep state as this very real thing in Turkey, in Italy, and wherever else you want to point to. But for someone like Trump, the deep state is useful precisely because it's not specific, because it's not bounded, because you can point to anyone and say, deep state, it can be whatever he needs it to be. And that's a really useful thing to have for someone in power.
It absolutely is. And I think that, it creates this oppositionality where then people start clinging to deep state because they're being described as deep state. And it's like, so what if I am? A friend of mine was like, are they reappropriating deep state? But I knew so many people in the State Department who were like, oh yeah, I guess we are deep staters. And the idea is the meaning, but the meaning shifted. Right. And the meaning shifted between like this very specific historical phenomenon to like any structure of power, right? Or any structure of power I don't like is the deep state. Trump saying, oh, well, you're all engaged in a horrific conspiracy against me. You're all deep staters. You're all in league with some sort of, some sort of satanic force, which I alone am opposing, right? And it sets up this kind of, it really raises the temperature, right? And it really creates this sort of like this sense of an existential dread, right? And an existential felt threat, which also, if it's undefined and secret, then if you say no, but that doesn't exist, it just means that you haven't proven it yet. And like I really don't know how to proceed with this idea, considering with talking about this, where I think clearly people in like the State Department are working for a Defense Department subcontractor saying, I'm in the deep state. No, you're not. But but also, there are certain weird things where I think there clearly has in the past couple of months been some sort of decision or inflection point or shift to basically hit Trump with a lot of stuff that was probably known, right? That, hey, the president just walked out with a bunch of nuclear secrets. That at the point of loss or breach that has happened. And I think that it just wasn't a political reality to act on it. And so I think there are definitely, in terms of the federal the federal investigations against Trump going on right now, maybe some behind closed door decision has been made that like, now he's really gone too far this time. We are raiding Mar-a-Lago. We are hitting him with like messing with actual state secrets. He's also a man who's been under some kind of criminal investigation for most of his adult life. So that's, kind of normal for him. But I think we are at a point where this sort of, splicing these hairs might seem very pedantic, but I actually think it's really important in terms of like, well, what's happening? How does state power function? How does state power function outside of public scrutiny, but still within a framework of, things running effectively, of being under some manner of control versus institutions just breaking off and kind of doing their own thing. And this is why I think, the thing in the piece that caused me the most heartburn in the thing in the piece is I do kind of hand wave away talking about, has there been a deep state in the United States, which is a very thorny question, I think, especially when you're talking about the 60s and 70s, when you're talking about, some of these unanswered questions about the Kennedy assassination or the death of MLK, or even a lot of foreign policy decisions made about the Cold War, Vietnam. Whatever that being said, there's not this level of like, okay, we've been caught. GTEM was found out about and shut down. It doesn't exist anymore, right?
Right.
Other forms of parallel social organization in Turkey, might and may well do. At this point, Erdogan, for example, no longer really says deep state, but he likes to say like the parallel structure, basically referring to the Gülen movement.
Why do you? Sorry to interrupt you there, but why do you suppose that he gave up on deep state? Because for so many of these sort of Trump-style populists, of which you could argue that Erdogan is one, it's a really useful thing to use. I mean, Trump has made massive amounts of hay from it. You had Boris Johnson in his resignation speech talking about the deep state sabotaging Brexit. Yeah. So why is Erdogan going, actually, this isn't for me anymore?
Well, I do think that's a really good point, because, I think what we're really talking about is discourse, right? We're talking about the deep state as an idea which politicians deploy to mean something that matters to them.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that what it used to mean.
Exactly. And I think that the specificity of the deep state being these sort of state-connected security apparatuses, right? Which for Erdogan, he also really himself always meant it to mean the Kemalist, secularist army and intelligence connected elites, which he was going up against as an erstwhile democratic populist. And so for him, he spent decades crafting an image of this kind of arrogant, out of touch, anti-democratic elite, which he called the deep state, that, and look, the army did not like him. Erdogan did spend time in jail before he went into politics, right?
Yeah.
And he really meant it to mean those guys. So it became a positional fight. It became a calque in Turkish society of the deep state meaning this kind of, from is, the classic is like the from Izmir, Europhile, ultra secularist, learned German or French, is an army officer, thinks that the people aren't ready to govern themselves. Like, it just meant so many things. Then it turned into this decades long positional fight. If you look at the Ergenekon trials, which was a putative army coup attempt that was being planned against Erdogan, all this stuff that happened in Turkey over a long time, that when he was saying, this derin devleti, and when it also came to be synonymous with sort of his putative democratic openness, right, which he was really pitching himself as being into in the early 2000s, it just became so loaded with baggage that he couldn't turn around and then say, actually, the deep state is this religious brotherhood. It's also that.
His opponents changed, and so he needed something new.
Right, exactly. And I think that when, Trump is going on about, it's the deep state, or you're doing the deep state, and even people, the thing that kind of proves that his version of the deep state isn't the deep state is when Mike Pompeo, when Trump said, oh, it's the State Department, and Pompeo went, haha, more like deep state department. obviously trying to butter up. But I was sitting there watching that teleconference. I was like, dude, you're the Secretary of State and you just called yourself a deep state network. Like, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. But I think discursively, it is how it could work out. If we're capitulating this to just mean like the administrative mechanisms of the American state, right? If the deep state just means that, then then we're taking that off the table to discuss things which are really terrifying. Because I think, especially as there's a greater level of executive dysfunction, and obviously I'm most familiar with like American foreign policy, I think you're starting to see deep state-ish characteristics from organizations like Joint Special Operations Command, right? Or parts of the military. And so if we've taken this term off the table, then that actually is dangerous, because then if we're talking about, hey, there seem to be a lot of QAnon conspiracists like infiltrating certain key parts of the police and military.
Yes.
And they're like, well, I'm, the only reason I'm, not investigating Proud Boys and I'm going to Trump rallies and like throwing flashbangs at Black Lives Matter protesters, is to fight the deep state. And it's like, buddy, like, you're the deep state at this point. Like, you're the cop. You're the Navy SEAL. Like, that's where it comes from. And so I think that, what I talked about at the end of the piece was sort of this fear that the elements that are purportedly fighting a deep state.
I'm going to interrupt you there because I want to get to that in a bit. But first, I wanted to talk a bit about, talking about sort of Erdogan stopping this, Trump picking it up. I mean, the man who you at least theorize may have brought the deep state to Trump's attention is precisely one of those kinds of people that you're talking about. I mean, it's General Mike Flynn, who served for 22 days as Trump's national security advisor.
But what a 22 days they were. And Flynn is the man in this, where he's such an interesting lens to look at all of this through, because it is this kind of American life from like hardcore special forces cold warrior to weird grifter to, I'm saying weird grifter to talk about his flip into being a highly compensated pro-Turkish lobbyist, not even his second incarnation as a weird grifter, being a sort of a QAnon guy. And I think looking at, and this is the thing in this conversation where I think looking at things like individual lives and individual trajectories is really valuable. Because the story of Mike Flynn is also kind of very revealing about how American power and state power functions, and the ways that it gets deep state-ish and the ways that it doesn't. Because, the thing is with Mike Flynn is he's this army officer, and he is a real war on terror, hardcore Islamophobe, right? He is obsessed. He was sort of seeing these sorts of, pan-Islamist conspiracies, these sorts of, the creeping threats. He was really into the idea of like, what they called like the long war, in the global war on terror era, the idea that this is a civilizational struggle, and then he kind of winds up outside, and he gets shown the door for being an abusive weirdo to work for, because he was also, part of this very war on terror era cult of like, as long as you are a special forces background guy who's incredibly physical fit and you are theatrically abusive to people, this means that you're a cool badass. It was kind of the attempt to be that kind of celebrity general. And he winds up kind of out in the cold, and then just immediately starts lobbying for the Turkish government for money.
As you do.
As you do. And this is one of those things that seems crazy until you realize you could just immediately leave government service as like a general, and then just take a bunch of money from a foreign government to argue for their position. He was getting a 6-figure check to make the case for the Turkish foreign policy in the United States. He immediately, when, the 2016 coup attempt happened in Turkey, he was like, oh, great. Mike Flynn just assumed that it was like a secularist army officer, that it was the old school Turkish deep state sort of cleaning house the way that he would proudly want them to do. Right. Yes. And it wasn't. And in a short couple of years, no harm, no foul, he's cashing checks to say that, turns out Armenia is a Russian and Iranian ally. It turns out that, he will, at this point, plans a covert operation on behalf of a foreign government on foreign soil to abduct a U.S. permanent resident, which Fethullah Gulen is a green card holder. And, that level of Mike Flynn as a rubric where you can go from the kind of the core of the emergent as a real Cold Warrior, like by the time you spend a lot of time backloading his career, right? You spend a lot of time talking about, his consultancies, his QAnon stuff, his, time as a general. But, the thing is you make general towards the tail end of a career. And it's pretty sparse, like what he was up to at that time, in the 80s.
But we do know some of it, right? And you talk about that in your article.
Yeah, and we can assume based off of his positions the institutions that he went through, because there were not many of them. And so, based on that background that he came out of, based on the time, based off of the schools that he rotated through and who would have been his instructors in the kind of small special warfare community at that time, when he was coming in at the tail end of the Cold War, which was a very hot time in the Cold War. When Reagan said we're going to do rollback, the 1980s was kind of, the rebirth of the U.S. Special Forces community as a group that trains groups deniably, right? So when you're looking at anywhere from Angola to Afghanistan to Nicaragua, these are all areas where they were out there, they were training people deniably to overthrow governments, right? And so, he comes out of that perspective where basically regime change is kind of his raison d'etre, or at least a substantial part of his professional background is building up local proxy forces, is
building up local deep states, you might even say.
Building up local deep states, exactly.
Kind of ironic.
It's strictly ironic.
Well, I think the Cold War flavor is something that, and this is something that you talk about in your piece, the Cold War flavor really runs through this entire story, because it's something that you brought up, which I think really doesn't get talked about enough in discussions about QAnon and the deep state and this whole sort of moment, is how important anti-communism is in I suppose we could call it the Q-ish belief system. So not just QAnon, but sort of QAnon adjacent Trump supporters, if you like.
Yeah.
And I think there's a few reasons that doesn't come up much. And it's partly because if you're told two things about someone, one of them is that they're an anti-communist and the other is that they believe that Hillary Clinton is harvesting adrenochrome from children, you're going to focus on the more lurid beliefs. That's what's gotten the most press attention.
Yeah.
But also it's because we've sort of got used to the far right accusing their opponents of communism. Yeah. And so it starts to look quaint, but I think that's a mistake, because it's not a coincidence that this stuff's popular with baby boomers, right? Like, these people still think that they're fighting the Cold War. They believe that the US government was taken over by communists.
Yes. And that's such a powerful and important point when you're talking with QAnon, is sort of like, it's almost like a when prophecy fails type of situation, because all these structures for like 40, 50 years were built up to fight communism. And I'm not talking about just like organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency or U.S. Special Forces Command. I'm talking like social attitudes, like, a kind of baseline knee-jerk reflexive anti-communism, and also what the John Birch Society did, which is the idea that urban elites are somehow all behind this idea to kind of water down and dilute your values. I mean, all the stuff that they're saying about critical race theory or trans kids in schools or whatever is really just repurposed, John Birch Society stuff. So it's this point where I say when prophecy fails, because it's like, well, communism is a believable ideological rival, has gone away, basically. But the anti-communism hasn't. And so it's this kind of, this well-oiled, actually triumphant machine going around and looking for a target. And the number of organizations in Q world, like, the Unification Church, the Moonies, or just a lot of the accusations and tenor and the kind of playbook that they're running, or even what a lot of, increasingly mainstream Republicans are saying about, like, we have to defeat the socialist Democrats. We have to, fight communism. Like, anti-communist attitudes and ideas are so pervasive. And when you look at January 6th, there was a small but very present contingent of ultra right-wing Vietnamese Americans flying the South Vietnamese flag in the crowd. You can see it in some of the photos, right? And so there are still, there were Cuban flags, from anti-Castro Cubans from Miami, which there's a big chunk of a big QAnon contingent from that kind of political and social milieu. These forces are still present, right?
Yeah.
And just because just because the enemy goes away doesn't mean the army you built to fight the enemy didn't.
It's like you say, it's Cold War coming home.
Yeah.
It's this classic idea of blowback.
Yeah. It's that idea that like, hey, this is all, you're just going to do this to yourself eventually, right? This is all going to be kind of coming back. And I think that and a kind of zombie anti-communism together creates a uniquely potent kind of social and institutional brew in the United States. And one thing I also am increasingly kind of uncomfortable with and fraught with, I got the sense with a lot of my coworkers at the State Department, where if one day, just like the FBI director or like Mattis or somebody just got on TV and was like, the president's done, like he's gone, okay, like we have him in custody, caretaker administration until we have an election, that's it. I don't know if people would have really been too upset about that. You know what I mean? Like there was this very visceral hope for like, please can't our institutions save us? This lionization of anyone who would stand as an institutional bulwark against right-wing authoritarianism, which, bringing it back to Turkey, is absolutely the attitude you see among like secular Kemalists historically about Islamist politicians in Turkey, but also to this day. I say Kemalist is shorthand for followers of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the Turkish military. So there are these two very uncomfortable things that we're kind of left with in the wake of January 6th and the kind of QAnon's big shining moment, which I definitely feel that QAnon is not regressing, but it's definitely doesn't have the prominence it once did. And I feel like it's about to metastasize into something even weirder.
Yeah, I mean, is that not partly because, particularly since the Mar-a-Lago raid, the temperatures just got so much hotter that a lot of the stuff that QAnon was doing, you don't really need this bizarre theology anymore. Trump will just say it outright. And so, you don't need to have this adrenochrome harvesting thing to get ready for the fight. They're already sort of at that point, a lot of his supporters.
I unfortunately, I think that's the case, but I think we're all picking battle lines. I think that there's obviously a much, much larger space for anti-democratic action on the right, because there's a willingness to use violence there that's documented, multiple domestic terrorist attacks. There's explicit eliminationist rhetoric against minorities, fantasizing about race war, a willingness to accept domestic terrorists into the fold. If you look at like Kyle Rittenhouse, the guy who blasted Black Lives Matter protesters, just getting standing ovations at political conferences. And I feel pretty comfortable in predicting that Kyle Rittenhouse has a political future in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. But also in the reaction to that, I feel like there is now a willingness to call in the big guns, to use brute state power, in a space of a lack of confidence about a democratic, open, pluralistic kind of victory against far-right populism. It's like, well, maybe we just get someone to arrest this guy.
So what do you do then against, when you have a situation like you have now, where you have the far right training for war, the militia movement growing, people sort of talking about war, even quite mainstream pundits talking about civil war on Fox News. If that gets just a little bit hotter and you start to see more street violence like you were seeing in Portland, what do you do other than use the state? I mean, what would your sort of alternative be?
I think actually there's a great article New Lines just put out about how the anti-fascists won in Portland, where it was a mass mobilization. And there was a pretty broad coalition from real crazy, hardcore street fighting anarchists to moms and dads out there doing logistical support, to just a kind of, democracy in the fullest sense, rejecting the terms of this fight, right? I think that all this emphasis, I've talked a lot about the state, I've talked a lot about anti-democratic violence, I talked a lot about the Cold War, and the thing that really hasn't come up, remember, these are all anti-democratic projects, right? These are projects against mass social movements. I think that's the answer, right? I think that mass-based mobilizing is the answer. I don't think sitting at home and waiting for the FBI or the Capitol Police or some other arm of the state to come save you is going to cut it. And so, I'm a bit of a one-trick pony with this. The answer is always more democracy, a greater mass democratic participation in our own communities where we are, to kind of build social forces that can counteract this sort of thing.
Josef Burton, thank you very much.
All right, thanks. It's been great being on.
This has been The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. You can find Josef on Twitter at PinstripeBungle and read his article, The Deep State, The Conspiratorial Turn in America, on our website, newlinesmag.com. This week's episode was produced and hosted by me, Joshua Martin. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app. Thank you all for joining us.